Imagine for a moment that beneath the streets you walk every day, beneath the asphalt and concrete of modern American cities, there exists another world, a vast sprawling network of tunnels, chambers, and passageways that were sealed decades ago, filled with concrete, bricked over, and deliberately erased from public memory. Imagine that these subterranean labyrinths once served purposes so fundamental to urban life that entire populations moved through them daily. Yet today, when construction workers accidentally break through into these forgotten spaces, city officials quickly classify the discoveries, seal the breaches, and issue no further comment. What were these tunnels really used for? And more importantly, why does the mere mention of them seem to trigger such immediate and coordinated suppression? To understand the mystery of America's sealed underground, we must first step back into the world of the late 19th century, a time that presents us with one of history's most perplexing paradoxes. The official narrative tells us that America in the 1870s and 1880s was a young nation, barely a century old, still recovering from a devastating civil war, populated by rugged pioneers and newly arrived immigrants who were supposedly building civilization from scratch in the wilderness. Yet when we examine the photographic evidence from this era, when we study the architectural achievements and infrastructure projects completed during these decades, we encounter something that simply does not align with this story of a primitive developing nation. Consider the cities themselves. San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia. By the 1870s, these urban centers already possessed architectural magnificence that rivals and often surpasses what we build today. Multi-story buildings constructed from massive granite and marble blocks, each stone weighing several tons, fitted together with such precision that a blade cannot slip between them. Elaborate facades decorated with intricate carvings, classical columns, ornate cornices, and sculptural elements that required master craftsmen and years of skilled labor. Grand railway stations with soaring iron and glass roofs spanning hundreds of feet without internal supports. Water systems, sewage networks, gaslighting infrastructure, telegraph lines, all implemented on a city-wide scale within the span of just a few decades. But here is where the paradox deepens. While we see evidence of this extraordinary architectural and engineering capability, we are simultaneously told that the population of these cities was relatively small. Chicago, for instance, supposedly had fewer than 300,000 residents in 1870, yet the photographic record shows us a city of massive buildings, miles of developed streets, extensive port facilities, and industrial infrastructure that seems to require millions of hands to have constructed. The timeline itself becomes absurd when we calculate the labor required. If we accept the official population figures and account for children, the elderly, and those engaged in other occupations, we are left with an impossibly small workforce that somehow erected what amounts to an entire modern city in the span of 20 or 30 years. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. Now let us descend beneath these magnificent streets into the underground world that exists below. In city after city across America, there are stories, sometimes official records, sometimes only local legends, of extensive tunnel systems. Not the modern subway tunnels we know today, but older passages, often much larger, constructed with the same precision and quality as the buildings above. In Seattle, the famous underground city remains partially accessible to tourists, yet what they show represents only a fraction of the tunnels that exist. Local researchers have documented sealed passages leading off in all directions, some of them large enough to drive carriages through. In Portland, the Shanghai tunnels are acknowledged to exist, though the official explanation, that they were used for kidnapping sailors, seems almost deliberately absurd when one considers the architectural investment required to build such an extensive network. Chicago's tunnel system is perhaps the most documented yet simultaneously the most suppressed. Official records acknowledge a freight tunnel network constructed in the 1890s, yet photographs from the 1870s show tunnel entrances already existing, already sealed and abandoned. There are accounts from construction workers who, while excavating for modern building foundations, have broken into large brick-lined chambers and passageways that do not appear on any city maps. These discoveries are invariably sealed, filled with concrete, and removed from discussion. Why? Boston's tunnel system connects to one of the most intriguing aspects of this mystery, the question of street-level changes. In city after city, we find evidence that the current street level is significantly higher than the original ground level. Buildings that now appear to be single-story structures were originally 2 or 3 stories tall, with their lower floors now buried beneath accumulated fill. In some cases, entire first floors have become basements. The official explanation is that cities deliberately raised their street levels, sometimes by as much as 10 or 15 feet, to improve drainage and sanitation. But when we examine this claim carefully, it begins to unravel. Consider the logistics of such an operation. To raise the street level of an entire city requires bringing in millions of tons of fill material. It means that every building must either be raised, an extraordinarily difficult engineering feat, or have its lower floors abandoned and filled in. It means that all existing infrastructure, water pipes, gas lines, sewer systems, must be rebuilt at the new higher level. The disruption to daily life would be total and would continue for years. Yet we are told that cities accomplished this massive transformation while simultaneously experiencing rapid growth, continued construction, and normal commerce. The timeline once again does not hold together, but there is another possibility, one that the evidence increasingly supports. What if the lower levels of these cities were not deliberately buried by human effort? What if instead these cities experienced a catastrophic event, or series of events, that resulted in massive deposits of mud, ash, and debris that buried the lower portions of buildings and filled the tunnel systems? What if the raising of street level was not an engineering project but an aftermath operation, an attempt to rebuild on top of destruction? Photographs from the late 1800s show something peculiar in city after city. In images of construction sites, excavations, and street repairs, we see layers of debris, burned timbers, and compressed material that look less like intentional fill and more like the aftermath of disaster. In some photographs, partially buried buildings appear to have been abandoned in haste, their windows still intact, their doors still in place, simply overtaken by deposits of earth and material. The tunnel systems themselves show signs of catastrophic abandonment. When urban explorers manage to access sealed sections, always at risk of criminal trespass charges, they report finding passages filled with hardened mud and debris, sometimes containing artifacts that suggest sudden abandonment. Tools left in place, lanterns still hanging on hooks, even in a few documented cases, skeletal remains. These are not tunnels that were carefully decommissioned and sealed for rational infrastructure reasons. These are passages that were overwhelmed, buried, and later sealed to hide evidence of what had happened. Consider the timing. In city after city, the major street-raising projects occurred in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. In Chicago, the most extensive work happened after the Great Fire of 1871, which we are told destroyed much of the city. But here is the paradox. Photographs taken shortly after the fire show vast areas of destruction, yet the buildings that remain standing and the ruins themselves show signs of catastrophic damage that is inconsistent with a normal urban fire. Granite blocks cracked from intense heat, metal girders twisted and melted, yet wooden structures nearby somehow survived. The pattern of destruction suggests something far more devastating than a fire that supposedly started in a barn and spread through the city. What if the Great Chicago Fire was not the cause, but the effect? What if it was part of a larger catastrophe? 1871 was not an isolated year of disaster. That same year saw massive fires in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, where entire towns were incinerated with such intensity that people who fled into rivers and lakes were boiled alive. The official death toll exceeded 1,000, but local accounts suggest it was far higher. Entire communities simply vanished. That same autumn saw devastating fires in Michigan, Holland, and Manistee, fires so intense and widespread that the sky turned dark for days, and ash fell like snow across multiple states. These were not normal fires. Survivors described walls of flame that moved faster than horses could run, that generated their own winds, that ignited everything simultaneously rather than spreading gradually from building to building. They described a sky that turned strange colors, orange, red, green, before the fires struck. Some accounts mention earthquakes immediately preceding the fires. Others describe sounds like thunder or artillery, though the skies were clear. The official explanation blames dry conditions and strong winds, but this cannot account for the scale, intensity, and simultaneity of these conflagrations. Multiple cities across multiple states separated by hundreds of miles, all experiencing catastrophic fires within days of each other, all exhibiting the same unusual characteristics. all leaving behind patterns of destruction that include melted stone and metal. Now consider another layer of strangeness. In the decades immediately following these fires and the supposed street-raising projects, there was a massive influx of orphans into American cities. Orphan trains carried tens of thousands, some estimates say as many as 200,000, children from eastern cities to be distributed to families in the Midwest and West. The official story is that these were children of poor immigrant families or victims of urban poverty and disease. But the photographs tell a different story. These children are well-dressed, well-groomed, often formally posed in studio photographs. They do not look like street urchins or children from desperate poverty. They look like children of middle-class or even wealthy families who have somehow lost their parents. What happened to the parents? Disease and poverty are the standard answers, but they cannot account for the scale. We are talking about tens of thousands of children, all orphaned within a relatively short period, in cities that supposedly had small populations to begin with. The mathematics do not work unless we are looking at the aftermath of a massive loss of adult population, a catastrophe that killed parents while leaving children alive, that devastated cities while creating a generation of orphans who needed to be redistributed across the continent. The tunnel systems tie into this mystery in ways that only deepen the questions. In multiple cities, there are persistent accounts, often dismissed as urban legend, of large underground chambers that contained living spaces, furniture, personal effects, and even the remains of people who had taken shelter there. These accounts typically emerge from construction workers or utility crews who break into sealed sections and before they can be properly documented are ordered to reseal the spaces and speak to no one about what they found. Were people living in these tunnels? If so, why? The conventional explanation when such spaces are acknowledged at all is that they were storage areas or basements, but the furnishings and layout suggest otherwise. They suggest inhabited spaces, places where people lived, worked, and gathered. They suggest a population that had reasons to spend significant time underground, either because the surface was uninhabitable or because the underground offered advantages that the surface did not. The technology required to build these tunnel systems exceeds what we are told was available in the mid-19th century. The precision of the brickwork, the engineering of the ventilation systems, the scale of the construction, all of it suggests capabilities that do not match the official timeline of technological development. Some of the older tunnel sections show construction techniques that we would struggle to replicate today. Perfectly cut stone, fitted without mortar, creating chambers and passages that have remained stable for more than a century and a half despite being buried under modern cities. There is another pattern that emerges when we examine cities across America and compare them to cities in Europe and other parts of the world. In the 1860s and 70s, multiple cities experienced devastating fires, floods, and earthquakes that resulted in massive reconstruction efforts, and often the burial of lower street levels. London raised portions of its street level, Paris reconstructed entire neighborhoods, Constantinople, Rome, St. Petersburg, city after city shows evidence of similar transformations during this same narrow window of time. This is not a coincidence. What kind of global event could cause such widespread urban catastrophe? What kind of disaster could strike cities on multiple continents, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, all within the span of a few decades? The official history treats each city's disaster as an isolated local event, a fire here, a flood there, an earthquake somewhere else. But when we step back and look at the global pattern, we see something much larger, something that suggests a worldwide crisis that fundamentally altered human civilization. Could there have been a global cataclysm, perhaps multiple events occurring in sequence, that devastated civilization on a worldwide scale? Could the 19th century that we think we know be actually a period of recovery, a desperate attempt by survivors to rebuild on the ruins of something far more advanced? This would explain the paradoxes we observe. The magnificent architecture built supposedly by small populations, the advanced engineering that appears suddenly without developmental progression, the massive numbers of orphans, the sealed tunnels filled with evidence of catastrophic abandonment, and the worldwide pattern of urban reconstruction that peaks in the same narrow time frame. The photographic record provides tantalizing glimpses of this possibility. Early photographs of American cities, those taken in the 1850s and 60s, often show buildings that appear ancient, weathered, and damaged, standing amid scenes of ongoing reconstruction. These are not new buildings under construction. They are old buildings being repaired, cleaned, and put back into service. In some images, we can see work crews clearing debris from structures that appear to have been partially buried, excavating doorways and windows that had been covered with earth and mud. The sealed tunnels of American cities are more than just abandoned infrastructure. They are physical evidence of a truth that has been suppressed, that our civilization is younger than we think, built on the ruins of something older, and that the gap between our technological capability and the capability of our recent ancestors is far smaller, or possibly reversed, than we have been taught to believe. The tunnels speak of a population that built extensively underground, that had reasons to create subterranean cities, that possessed engineering knowledge we struggle to match today. Their ceiling speaks of catastrophe, of sudden abandonment, of the need to hide what happened. When we walk the streets of our cities today, we walk on top of another world, a buried world that once teemed with life, purpose, and activity. That world was not gradually replaced by something better. It was catastrophically destroyed, covered over, and deliberately forgotten. The magnificent buildings that remain above ground are fragments of something much larger, survivors of a devastation that we are not supposed to remember. And in the sealed darkness below, in spaces filled with concrete and marked with prohibitions, lies evidence that our entire understanding of recent history is a carefully maintained fiction. The suppression of this possibility is so complete, so systematic, that it can only be intentional. Whenever archaeological evidence emerges that suggests greater age or different origins for American structures, it is quickly explained away, buried in technical journals, or simply ignored by mainstream academic institutions. Research into old tunnel systems is actively discouraged, often through legal mechanisms that make it trespass or illegal entry to explore these spaces. Maps showing the extent of underground networks have been removed from public archives or remain classified. Photographs that might provide evidence of older construction or catastrophic damage have been systematically excluded from official historical collections. The pattern is too consistent across too many cities and too many institutions to be mere coincidence or bureaucratic indifference. Someone, somewhere made a decision that certain truths about our recent past must remain hidden, and that decision has been enforced with remarkable efficiency for more than a century. Why would anyone engage in such systematic suppression? What purpose does it serve to maintain a false narrative of history? The answer may lie in control. A population that believes it is part of a young, ascending civilization, one that is constantly progressing, constantly improving, is far easier to manage than a population that understands itself to be living in the ruins of something far greater, that knows it has experienced catastrophic loss and civilizational collapse. The 19th and 20th centuries were periods of enormous social engineering, of establishment of new power structures, of creation of systems of control that persist to this day. These systems required populations that believed in progress, in the inevitability of improvement, in the authority of institutions. Revelation that civilization had recently collapsed, that current institutions were not the culmination of steady advancement but desperate reconstruction efforts by survivors, would undermine this entire ideological framework. If people understood that we are living in a post-catastrophe world, that our ancestors possessed capabilities we have lost, that progress is not inevitable but fragile and reversible, the foundations of modern political and social organization would crumble. The indigenous peoples of North America preserve oral traditions that speak of previous civilizations, of peoples who came before, of great cities that were destroyed in catastrophes. These accounts are usually dismissed as mythology or misinterpretation, but what if they are historical memory? What if the Native American populations witnessed the collapse of a previous high civilization and preserved the memory of it in their traditions? Some tribes speak of white-skinned peoples who lived in great cities before a time of darkness and destruction. Others describe epochs of civilization that rose and fell before the current age. These accounts have parallels in the mythologies and traditions of indigenous peoples around the world, all describing similar patterns of advanced civilizations that were destroyed by global catastrophes. Perhaps these stories are not myths at all, but fragmentary memories of events that occurred within the last 2 centuries, events that have been systematically erased from official history. The oral traditions speak of a world that ended in fire and darkness, of survivors emerging to find their cities buried and their knowledge lost. They speak of a great forgetting, a deliberate erasure of memory carried out by those who sought to build a new order on the ashes of the old. The authorities who maintain the seals, who classify the discoveries, who discourage investigation into these spaces, They know something that the general population does not. They know that beneath our feet lies proof of catastrophic civilizational collapse, of lost populations, of technological regression, and of historical discontinuity. They know that the tunnels, if fully explored and honestly documented, would force a complete revision of modern history and would reveal that we are not the masters of an ascending civilization, but the descendants of survivors, living in a world we did not build and barely understand. The sealed tunnels are not just physical barriers, they are epistemological barriers, walls built to separate us from knowledge that would fundamentally alter our understanding of who we are and where we came from. Every sealed entrance, every concrete-filled passage, every classified map represents a conscious decision to maintain ignorance, to preserve a carefully constructed narrative that serves the interests of those in power. The question we must ask ourselves is, what happens when that narrative can no longer be maintained? What happens when enough people begin to notice the inconsistencies, the impossibilities, the evidence that refuses to stay buried no matter how much concrete is poured over it? This is why the tunnels remain sealed. Not because they are dangerous in any physical sense, many of them are structurally sound, built to last centuries, but because they are dangerous to the narrative, dangerous to the structures of power and belief that depend on that narrative. The truth beneath our cities is literally concreted over, buried under the weight of official denials and institutional indifference. But the evidence remains, waiting in the darkness, preserved in brick and stone, and the peculiar silence that surrounds any serious inquiry into what lies below. And perhaps one day, when enough people begin asking the right questions, those seals will be broken, those tunnels will be explored, and the true history of our recent past will finally emerge into the light, revealing a story far stranger and more tragic than anything we have been taught to believe. The walls are already cracking, the concrete is already failing, and beneath our feet, in the darkness that has been deliberately maintained for generations, the truth waits to be rediscovered. The only question that remains is whether we have the courage to face it. This has been ARCHONYM. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the hidden depths of history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never stop looking beneath the surface of what you have been told is true.